especially those Canadians that he recommended Bitcoin to 6 months ago, who may have taken his advice and purchased it, who would now have seen their life savings devastated. He owes it to them to come into this House and to explain his position on cryptocurrency. He can't wait for it to just go up and down and pick and choose when he wants to talk about it based on where it happens to be, but he owes it to Canadians to give them an explanation, and I hope he does it soon.
The honourable member for Kingston and the Islands has 2 minutes coming his way to finish off his argument when we come back. Statements by members. Déclaration de député. The honourable member for Brampton South.
Mr. Speaker, September is Ovarian Cancer Awareness Month. More than 3,000 Canadians will be diagnosed with ovarian cancer this year. I know the impact of this terrible disease on families and loved ones of those fighting cancer. A very special person in my life is a fighter, and every fighter's story is inspiration to all of us. Mr. Speaker, many researchers and advocates in Canada are determined to save lives. I want to commend their hard work. I want to thank all Ovarian Cancer Canada volunteers in Brampton and across the country for working to raise awareness. Supporting researchers and raising awareness saves lives of women. Together, let's build a bright future for women, because there simply is no time to wait when it comes to ovarian cancer. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Bow River.
On the second annual National Day for Truth and Reconciliation 2022 has been historic for the Siksika Nation in the Bow River. The ambition of the Siksika people is reflected in their legendary late Chief Crowfoot. A fierce warrior, wise diplomat, chief among chiefs, Crowfoot was steadfast in his negotiations of Treaty No. 7 in 1877 between the Blackfoot Confederacy and the Crown. His ceremonial regalia, though, from the signing was on display in English museums for decades. This spring, it was returned to its rightful home at Blackfoot Crossing, the site of the signing of Treaty No. 7. Direct descendant Chief Ulray Crowfoot, together with his council, led the campaign to return the regalia. Growing and progressing Siksika Nation, like taking control of policing and future palliative care facility on the nation, are tangible actions towards self-determination, reminding us that reconciliation is a shared agreement to live and prosper together.
Hear, hear. L'honorable député de...
The member for Vimy. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm honored to rise in the House today to mark the 62nd anniversary of the independence of the Republic of Cyprus on October 1st. Since 1960, Canada and Cyprus have enjoyed historic relations. Our two states have developed strong bilateral relations with respect to our membership and work in multilateral organizations, including La Francophonie, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the WTO, and UNESCO.
Cyprus extends beyond words. Since the inception of the United Nations Peacekeeping Force in Cyprus, over 25,000 Canadian Armed Forces members have been deployed and 28 killed in an effort to maintain peace on the island. This year underscores the importance of Canada standing by its partners in commemorating their pursuit of democratic values and liberty. Moreover, the need for Canada to support its friends as they struggle against occupation, tyranny, and violence. Canada applauds the Cypriot people's achievements and seeks to maintain close ties into the future. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
L'honorable député de Shefford.
The member for Shefford. Mr. Speaker, October 1st marks World Seniors Day. It's an opportunity to recognize their diversity, but also to reflect collectively on their place in our society. With rising inflation, let's recognize that those on fixed incomes are directly affected and that they need an increase in old age security starting at age 65. Let's not leave them in a state of financial insecurity. Let's also allow those who want to stay in the workforce to do so and to give them tax relief. The Liberals prefer to impoverish people aged 65 to 75 and force them to stay on the labor market. But we at the Bloc want to treat them as the engines of the community that they are. We owe them our respect. They've shaped Quebec. The benefits of intergenerational ties and active agents have been increasingly demonstrated. They bring us wealth, so it's our duty to treat them with the utmost respect and to ensure that the social safety net allows them to live with dignity. The member for Sherbrooke. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The rising cost of living is hitting all Canadians. With our plan to make life more affordable, we want to limit the effects of global inflation. Our support also includes continued funding for community organizations, which are essential to the well-being of Sherbrooke residents and to the development of the social economy. This is the case of Moisson Estrie, which, thanks to its efforts, distributes food to more than 50 organizations in my region. And I'd like to congratulate Christian Bibeau on his recent appointment as Director General. With the increase in food prices and the ongoing labor shortage, there will be many challenges during his mandate. So let's continue to support organizations like Moisson Estrie, notably through the local food infrastructure fund, so that they can help more families in need. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable member for Pitt Meadows, Maple Ridge.
Mr. Speaker, over 150,000 First Nations, Inuit, and Métis children were placed in residential schools. The experience was devastating and has left generational scars on so many. The children were removed from their families, from their cultural traditions, and forbidden to speak their languages. The purpose was supposedly education, but assimilation was top of mind. It was a government knows best approach, and the government was wrong. The legacy of Indian residential schools has been a great deal of brokenness, pain, and loss. My father, my aunts, my uncles attended residential schools. Dad served in the Canadian military for decades. He kept silent about being Métis until he left. Because of societal prejudices towards Indians, he was hesitant to being identified as one. Tomorrow is Truth and Reconciliation Day, a day to reflect, to pray for healing, and to rebuild bridges with our Indigenous peoples. Thank you.
The honourable member for Pickering-Uxbridge.
Mr. Speaker, I rise to highlight Pickering councillor Bill McLean, who is retiring this year and will not be on the ballot after 22 years of service. Councillor McLean and I served on council together for about 10 of his 22-year career. Councillor McLean and I did not always agree on issues. In fact, we had a few fiery meetings together, but it was actually the wise intervention of our government House leader who knew us both and helped us realize we were more aligned than we thought. And am I ever glad that he did, because Bill became one of my closest friends and earliest mentors. Working with Bill was truly inspiring and an honor. He is a man of integrity, and as a former Toronto police officer, his vows to serve and protect is at the core of who Bill is. He taught me so much about service, but how to fight for your community and be a voice for the voiceless. Council will not be the same without him, but selfishly, I'm hoping to be able to spend more time with my friend and his wife, Diana. Family is what Bill loves most in this world, and I'm so glad he'll have more time with his. Bill, thank you for your service to our community.
Hear, hear. The honourable member for Brampton East.
Mr. Speaker, constituents in my riding of Brampton East and across Canada are celebrating the Hindu festival of Navratri. I'm grateful to be able to rise in the House today to share my gratitude and appreciation to so many friends and neighbours in Brampton East who invited me to join in on their festivities. Navratri is a time for dancing, prayer, reflection, and celebration, all of which I had the pleasure to be a part of. At its core, the shared message of Navratri is the triumph of good over evil, which is something all Canadians collectively value in various ways. When we take an active effort and allow knowledge to outweigh ignorance, it bridges the gap between communities and people. I hope everyone has the opportunity to learn more about Canada's vibrant Hindu community and their considerable contributions to the advancement of Canada's economic and social prosperity. I look forward to attending further events in Brampton East over the course of the festival. I'd like to wish everyone celebrating a very happy Navratri. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Barrie Springwater, Oro Medonte.
Mr. Speaker, the new conservative leader will put the people first.
Hear, 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 hear.
Their paychecks, their savings, they are home in their country. Canadians are struggling to make ends meet. The residents of Barrie, Springwater, Ormerante are no exception to this crisis.
That's right.
A recent article in Barrie Today quotes Sharon Palmer, the executive director of the Barrie Food Bank, as saying that the rising cost of fuel, rent, and food have resulted in a rising number of people accessing their services. Ms. Palmer also stated, quote, "Everything we buy is more expensive now," end of quote. She noted that the food bank is now seeing individuals returning to use the food bank that they haven't seen in several years. Another trend the executive director has seen is residents who historically donated to the food bank are now using it for food themselves. I would like to thank all the workers at the food banks across Canada for supporting residents during this affordability crisis. I would also like to reassure Canadians that help is on the way. The new leader of our Conservative Party is committed to assisting Canadians. Our leader offers hope. He will stop all proposed Liberal tax hikes, allow Canadians to keep their hard-earned money, fight to keep inflation down, and make life affordable again.
The honourable member for Labrador.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In the wake of Hurricane Fiona, people in Newfoundland and Labrador's West Coast communities, like other Atlantic Canadians, are suffering in the aftermath. But together they are managing the devastating damage left behind. Fiona ripped homes from foundations, wrecked public and private property, collapsed buildings, washed out roads, and took down power lines, leaving shorelines soaked in debris. And saddest of all, it robbed lives from loving families. Our deepest condolences to these families who have lost loved ones in this hurricane. In the aftermath of Fiona, we are also witnessing the true kindness of Newfoundlanders and Labradorians and Canadians, of neighbours helping neighbours, of over 800 Canadian Armed Force troops on the ground working hard, hydro crews from other regions helping restore power, and Canadians stepping up to support with food and clothes donations, and over $10 million in disaster relief donations to the Red Cross that our government will be matching. As the Prime Minister and our government has recognized, the road to recovery is a long path, and there is a lot of work to do. So please join me in offering the support to all of these people that need it today, and let them know that we will be there to support their communities and their families as they restore and rebuild.
Member for Dufferin-Caledon.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the new Conservative leader will put the people first. Their paychecks, their savings, their homes, and their country. Mr. Speaker, the carbon tax is an utter failure. We know this. There's two ways to measure it. The first is, has it reduced emissions? No. It absolutely has not. The second is, does it put more money back into the pockets of Canadians? No. The Parliamentary Budget Office has been unequivocal on this. Most Canadians lose money as a result of the carbon tax. Yet this Liberal government is pushing forward with tripling the carbon tax by April of 2023. I guess the Environment Minister and the Prime Minister are experiencing the carbon tax differently than average Canadians. But help is on the way. A Conservative government led by our new leader will cut the carbon tax.
The honourable member for Regina Louvain.
The new Conservative leader will put the people first. People feel like they've lost control of their pocketbooks and their lives. The cost of government is driving up the cost of living. This Liberal government has doubled our national debt, adding more debt than all previous governments combined. It's simple. This expensive government is costing Canadians more. The more these Liberals spend, the more the price of everyday essentials go up. The results? Families downgrade their diets to cover the 10% year-over-year jump in food prices. Seniors delay their retirements and watch their life savings evaporate before their eyes. 30-year-olds are trapped in 400-square-foot apartments or worse, their parents' basements. Why? Because house prices have doubled because of this incompetent Liberal government. Many are falling behind, and there are people in this country who are just hanging on by a thread. These are our citizens of our country. We are their servants. We owe Canadians hope.
The honourable member for Ottawa Centre.
Monsieur le Président.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today as a settler on the traditional lands of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people to pay my respects and to commemorate those lost as a result of our nation's colonial past. Tomorrow is National Day of Truth and Reconciliation, an opportunity to reflect on the tragic history of colonialism and the intergenerational impact of residential schools. On days like this, I often speak to my children about the honor of living on unceded land and the importance of working towards reconciliation. Tomorrow, I ask that all Canadians stop, wear orange, and think about how they can walk the path of reconciliation, whether your family came to this country generations ago or you are a recent immigrant. It's up to all of us to listen, to make positive changes, and to right the wrongs of the past. Thank you.
Thank you, Speaker. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge Raymond Nunez and his family living in Nunavut. Speaker, crimes, ignorance, and neglect by governments continue to this day. We are the parliamentarians that can help stop the process of colonial laws. We must be the parliamentarians that transforms our work from empathy to action. Reconciliation must reflect the needs of Indigenous people. Thank you, Speaker.
The member for Manicouagan. Mr. Speaker, it's important for me to speak today to mark the Day of Truth and Reconciliation. It must be a day of memory and reflection, of being and becoming. So we need to remind ourselves today that reconciliation can only be achieved once the truth has come out. This means that reconciliation begins with an objective knowledge of the past of Aboriginal nations, a past that is so close yet so far away, but which still hurts. As well, by understanding and acknowledging this past, we can come together to work side by side in a spirit of respect and trust to take all the healing actions we need to take. To all Aboriginal nations, the Bloc Québécois and myself reiterate our full commitment. We hear you, we understand you, and we will stand by you without fail. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Carleton.
Today I rise to add my voice to those who condemn the oppression of the Iranian government against its innocent people. We stand with the Iranian people. The protests that have unleashed over the last several weeks as a result of the morality police murdering a young woman, Mahsa Amini, because she dared to confront the Iranian regime and fight for her freedom. These protests against that action have been nothing short of inspiring. Conservatives, including my deputy leader, have been proud to join in these protests. For years, conservatives have demanded the government hold the Iranian regime accountable. Unfortunately, this government lifted sanctions on Iran as one of its very first actions, and the government still refuses to list the IRGC, the terrorist organization, as a terrorist body, allowing it to legally operate here in Canada. They claim that they cannot do this, even though CSIS has reported that the IRGC is responsible for shooting down PS 752, killing 50 Canadians. Mr. Speaker, it is time for accountability, and Conservatives will fight to restore it. Thank you.
The honourable member for Scarborough-Rouge Park.
Mr. Speaker, I rise to mark the second annual National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. This day recognizes the over 150,000 First Nations, Inuit, and Métis children who were forcibly separated from their families and their communities, and the immeasurable loss of language, culture, and identity. It is a day to honor the survivors and their resilience, and to mourn the many children who never returned home. This day also coincides with Orange Shirt Day, inspired by the childhood story of Phyllis Webstead, a residential school survivor from Canoe Creek Indian Band in British Columbia. Her grandmother gifted Phyllis an orange shirt to wear on her first day at St. Joseph Mission Indian Residential School. When she arrived, her new shirt was forcibly taken from her. I call upon all Canadians to reflect on this painful legacy of colonialism and our historical responsibility to seek truth, ensure accountability, and walk the path of reconciliation. I urge everyone to wear an orange shirt and to stand in solidarity with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis across Canada, today and every day. Bravo. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral questions, question orale, the Honourable Leader of the Opposition. The Liberals and the Bloc want to punish Quebecers for the crime of driving a conventional car by tripling the carbon tax. And the federal government is preventing the production of electricity for electric cars. The government of Quebec wants to build dams to create hydroelectric energy for those vehicles, but the Liberal government is trying to hinder those projects. Why doesn't the government cut the red tape, allow Quebec to build hydro dams, and eliminate the carbon tax at the same time? The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, Canadians, including Quebecers, understand full well a very important thing, and that is that the Conservatives do not have a plan for the climate. That's a huge failing of the Conservatives. But we understand the importance of climate action. And the people of Quebec, men and women in Quebec, understand the need for this, and that is what we will continue to do. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Government, the Liberals have no climate plan. What they have is a tax plan that has failed to reach a single solitary environmental target that they have set. Meanwhile, gas prices have hit $2.40 a litre in Vancouver. This is the same city which is the third most overpriced real estate market on earth. In other words, people can't afford to drive, they can't afford homes, and with food prices rising faster than in 40 years, they can't afford to eat either. Will the government show some compassion for British Columbians and Canadians and cancel its plan to triple the tax?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the Conservatives don't have a climate plan. All they have is a plan to take away $1,000 checks from families in Alberta and Saskatchewan. And you know what? They don't have a plan to make life more affordable for Canadians either. All they have is a plan to drain our pensions and our EI. Our government does have a fiscally responsible plan to support Canadians with affordability, and we have a plan to act on the climate. Canadians know that, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
The only ones draining EI of money is this government. They want to raid the EI fund for $10 billion. Take the money that Canadians pay in EI taxes and spend it on everything but EI. The minister admits she's going to raise EI taxes by $2.5 billion starting on January 1st. With Canadians facing the highest inflation in 40 years, just inflation, with Canadians struggling to feed themselves, what is this government thinking by raising taxes on paychecks?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, when you look past all the huffing and puffing, all the strutting and posturing, here's what's happened this week. The Conservatives have done a U-turn and accepted our targeted and fiscally responsible plan to help 11 million vulnerable Canadian families with GST rebates of nearly $500. Now it's time for the Conservatives to drop their utterly reckless scheme to drain our pensions and EI, and to support our plan to help Canadians pay their rent and take their kids to the dentist.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
The government has been draining the paychecks and pocketbooks of Canadians. Just this week, the Angus Reid Institute published a poll showing that 51% of Canadians are struggling to eat. In Canada, a G7 country, the majority of people cannot afford groceries. That is 7 years of this Liberal government. Canadians are out of money. This government is out of touch. Why won't they cancel their tax hikes so Canadians can afford to eat?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
You know, Mr. Speaker, you know who's out of touch? The people who are out of touch are a party that believes it's a good idea to slash our pensions and to undermine the EI system. You know what else is out of touch? It's out of touch not to have a plan to act on climate. And you know why that's out of touch, Mr. Speaker? Because our customers, our clients, the US and the EU, they are taking climate action. They will only buy Canadian products if we take climate action too.
Well, Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the minister totally ignored the question. 51% of Canadians cannot afford to eat. Food bank use has tripled and hits record every single month, according to the Daily Bread Association. Students are living in homeless shelters while they study. This is Canada. After 7 years of this Liberal government, getting worse now under this costly coalition. Will they wake up to what's going on in this country and cancel their heartless tax hikes?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, our government will take no lessons from the Conservatives when it comes to protecting vulnerable Canadians. Our government has lifted hundreds of thousands of Canadian children out of poverty with the Canada Child Benefit. We have lifted seniors out of poverty by increasing the OAS and by reversing the ruthless, cruel Conservative pension cuts. You know who owes Canadians an apology, Mr. Speaker? It is this new Conservative leader who recklessly advised them to destroy their life savings by investing in Bitcoin.
The Honourable Member for Belleuil-Chambly. Mr. Speaker, Roxham Road is challenging the numbers, the Liberal failures, the cultural integration, health, education. But we've seen tens of millions of dollars in contracts, untendered contracts, awarded to generous Liberal donors. So I would ask that the Committee on Ethics should have all those contracts awarded to it, those friendly contracts, those private contracts. I wonder if the Deputy Prime Minister is opposed to that. The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, I hope and I believe that there's one very important thing all members in this place can agree on, and that is the importance of immigration to Canada and to Quebec. The importance of immigration to our economy, and that's why our government believes in the strength of our immigration system and our refugee system. We will continue to work with all our partners, both abroad and in Quebec. The Honourable Member for Belleuil-Chambly. Mr. Speaker, I trust that all members in the House agree that Roxham Road is not about labor, it's about a humanitarian issue. So let's start over. Will the Deputy Prime Minister agree to table all the uncensored contracts to generous Liberal donors, will she agree to table all those contracts on the committee so that they can be examined? The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, we understand that the issue of Roxham Road is a border issue. It's an issue of our shared border with the U.S., and that is why we take the issue very seriously. We're working with our American counterparts on issues related to our shared border, including the Safe Third Country Agreement. And we're working very closely with concerned stakeholders on the situation at our border, and we will keep doing that.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Later today, I'll be meeting with Autumn Pelletier, a global Indigenous water activist, a fierce defender of water and our people. She launched a petition which has gained over 100,000 signatures calling on this government to address the water crisis in Indigenous communities. Tomorrow is Truth and Reconciliation Day. How can this government defend its record when so many Indigenous communities still don't have access to the basic right of clean drinking water?
Hear, hear. The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I would like to begin by thanking the member opposite for that very important question and for recognizing that tomorrow is Truth and Reconciliation Day. I think that we all recognize that Canada's an amazing place, but we're a country with an original sin. And that original sin is the treatment of Indigenous people in Canada. Our government is working very hard and very sincerely towards reconciliation, and I think all Canadians are. We recognize there is more work to do, and we're going to keep on working hard.
Hear, hear.
The Honourable Member for Burnaby South. Autumn Pelletier started a petition to force this government to settle the crisis of drinking water in Indigenous communities because this government broke its promise. Tomorrow is National Truth and Reconciliation Day. How is this government able to defend their record when so many Indigenous communities still don't have access to clean drinking water? The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister. I'd like to thank my colleague for his question. It's a very important one. I believe, and I'm fully convinced, that all members in this place share the same view, and that is that reconciliation is a central question, a core question for Canada. It's a political and a social question, but it's also a moral question. Our government is sincerely working on investing heavily in reconciliation. We understand that there's still a lot of work to be done, and we'll do it. The Honourable Member for Louis Saint Laurent. Mr. Speaker, if there's one subject that calls for no partisanship, and that is for Canadians to be able to eat enough, but unfortunately because of inflation, 4 out of 5 families have had to cut back on their food budget. The government has a choice. They can help Canadians directly, but they've committed to tripling the carbon tax. This will have a direct impact. Canadians are already having enough trouble. Will this government make the right decision and scrap this tripling of the carbon tax? The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, we understand that the cost of living and affordability is a huge issue for Canadian families, and that's why we're going to go ahead with payments to offset inflation. And I'm happy that ultimately the Conservatives agree with us and they're going to support our plan. Now is the time for the Conservatives to do another political flip-flop and support the other parts of our plan. The Honourable Member for Louis Saint Laurent. Well, talking about flip-flops, we're looking at a champion in this arena. They've broken tons of election promises. They said they were going to have a zero deficit in 2019. They broke that promise. And now they're announcing that they're going to triple their carbon tax. Mr. Speaker, here's a promise the Liberals should break. Could they please renege on their promise to triple the carbon tax? The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, now is the time to take the major issues Canada is facing seriously. And I believe and I hope that all members here will agree that we need climate action. As the Finance Minister, I understand full well the importance of climate action to our economy. If we don't create a green economy, it will be impossible for Canada to trade.
Are struggling to make ends meet under this Liberal government. In BC, the cost of gas is now over $2.25 a litre. The cost of groceries has skyrocketed to a 40-year high, but the Liberals are set to make things worse. On January 1st, the government is planning to increase taxes on paychecks, ripping money from Canadians' pockets and stuffing government coffers instead. Why won't the Liberals give Canadians a break from just inflation and just cancel their planned tax increases instead?
And the challenges facing Canadians on affordability are extremely important. That is why the government has acted to, for example, double the GST tax rebate to provide relief for Canadians that are struggling with inflation, which is a global concern. With respect to the price on pollution, though, the honourable member knows full well that the rebates that are provided to the vast majority of families in this country are more than they actually pay. And I would actually suggest to my colleague who comes from the same province as I in British Columbia that the price on pollution in British Columbia is a British Columbia-made price on pollution that was implemented far before the federal system because British Columbia was a leader in fighting climate change.
The honourable member for Chilliwack Hope.
Mr. Speaker, the BC price on pollution, as he calls it, hasn't reduced emissions, and the rebates do not go back to British Columbia as they go to the NDP government in Victoria. Mr. Speaker, what he would see is the tripling of the carbon tax, which would result in the $2.25 going to $3 a litre. We will never accept that, Mr. Speaker. Why won't he cancel the tripling of the carbon tax and stop gouging British Columbia families?
The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Mr. Speaker, I would suggest to the honourable member that if he has a problem with the fact that British Columbia does not rebate the money back, he should have a conversation with Premier Horgan. At the end of the day, the rebate system that is in place and wherever the federal backstop is in place provides more money back to people than they actually receive. The vast majority of Canadian households receive more money back. And with respect to his point about not reducing emissions, I suggest he look at some of the academic studies, including one from Duke University, which actually show that it does reduce carbon emissions.
The honourable member for Battleford's Lloydminster.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We know Liberal logic claims that the carbon tax will reduce emissions. But the reality is the Liberal carbon tax has had no meaningful impact on the environment.
That's right.
The carbon tax has only succeeded in driving up the cost of food, fuel, and home heating. And while their tax hikes dive deeper into the pockets of Canadians, it's more than just inflation that is making it even harder to make ends meet. Mr. Speaker, will the Prime Minister abandon his carbon tax hike, or is his goal truly to make the most basic necessities unaffordable?
Good question. The Honourable Minister.
I would say that certainly the issues of affordability are extremely important to every member in this House and to all Canadians. That is why the government has acted to address affordability issues. But with respect to some of the statements with respect to the price on pollution, I suggest that the honourable member do a bit more homework. 45-plus countries around the world have implemented a price on pollution. Virtually every academic study tells you that it is the most effective and efficient way to reduce emissions. And in Canada, emissions dropped by 9% in the last reported study. So what she is saying in this House is simply not true.
The honourable member for Battleford Lloydminster.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And you know, quite regularly when I ask questions in this place, it's typical for a Liberal member to mansplain me and tell me what I need to do, despite imposing a cost costly carbon tax on Canadians, the Liberals have failed to meet every single climate target that they set.
That's right.
The Liberal carbon tax has done and will do nothing for the environment. The only achievement of their carbon tax has been to drive up the cost of living and make basic necessities unaffordable. It is more than just inflation soaring. Canadians simply can't afford this Liberal government. Mr. Speaker, if the Prime Minister cares about affordability, will he...
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, if Conservatives cared about affordability, they would have voted in favor of the unanimous consent motion yesterday that would have saw hundreds of thousands of Canadians with disabilities lifted out of poverty by moving forward with the Canada Disability Benefit. If they cared about lifting people out of poverty and making life more affordable, they would help kids with disability have access to dental care. And if they wanted to make life more affordable for low-income Canadians with disabilities, they'd vote for rent help.
The Honourable Member for Lac-Saint-Jean. Mr. Speaker, all the people smuggling at Roxham Road would disappear in a snap if the federal government suspended the Safe Third Country Agreement. But the minister's doing the exact opposite. He's in expansion mode. He's building a city, according to Radio-Canada. In the face of record numbers of refugee claimants this year, the federal government isn't suspending the agreement, it's expanding its facilities. They're going to open a new complex on November 1st, which will serve until 2026. How much longer do they plan to support the expansion of the people smuggling business through Roxham Road? The Honourable Minister of Public Safety. Okay, ready? Great. Mr. Speaker, as I've said repeatedly, we have a very strong agreement with the U.S. to deal with some very complex issues. There are pressures at Roxham Road, and that's why we continue to cooperate with the Government of Quebec. We're investing to add resources with the CBSA and the RCMP, and we have to recognize that there's no simple solution. We have to keep working together. Thank you. Saint-Jean. The Honourable Member for Lac-Saint-Jean. Mr. Speaker, yesterday the Minister of Public Safety said he was very proud of the government's work in protecting the rights of refugees at Roxham Road. What's he proud of? Is he proud that families are being exploited by smugglers? Is he proud that it costs them up to $10,000 a head? Is that a good price? Is he proud that these families are welcomed into Canada by the police? Is he proud that it takes years for their claims to be processed? What part of this is the minister most proud of? The Honourable Minister of Public Safety. Mr. Speaker, I'm very proud that refugees continue to contribute to Canada. They're helping us solve our labor shortage in Canada. There are lots of examples of the contributions refugees make, and we will continue to invest to get the resources we need to deal with the situation at Roxham Road. And the only thing the bloc is bringing here is squabbling, not solutions. The Honourable Member for Lac-Saint-Jean. Yeah, we've been calling for the Safe Third Country Agreement to be suspended for 3 years now. Let's talk solutions. Let's talk about the negotiations with the Americans, too. Back in 2019, in their election platform, the Liberals were talking about working with the U.S. to modernize the Safe Third Country Agreement. At this point, you really have to wonder if any talks are happening. Meanwhile, the feds are opening new facilities at Roxham Road. When will they suspend the Safe Third Country Agreement instead of cutting ribbons at Roxham Road? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Mr. Speaker, it's our duty to protect Canadians and public safety and safety at the border. At the same time, refugee claimants have to be treated with compassion, and the law has to apply properly and fairly to them. The Safe Third Country Agreement is an important tool for managing our border. We are in constant communication with the U.S. government about border issues, including the Safe Third Country Agreement. The Honourable Member for Saskatoon West.
Mr. Speaker,
the Finance Minister may want to consult the Government of Canada's financial literacy website. The section called Tax Basics lists the types of taxes Canadians pay: income tax, GST, and yes, the federal payroll taxes of EI and CPP. Despite the Finance Minister's protests, her own website clearly states that these are taxes. Any tax hike, including raising payroll taxes, only serves one purpose: taking money out of the pockets of Canadians. Mr. Speaker, will the Prime Minister cancel his planned tax increases on Canadian paychecks?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the member opposite has just said that our CPP contributions and our EI contributions only serve the purpose of taking money out of the pockets of Canadians. Think about that for a minute. That is absolutely reckless. We contribute to the CPP so our seniors can have pensions when they retire. Not everyone is a member of Parliament. Not everyone has the pensions that the members opposite and members on this side of the aisle enjoy. We need to be responsible. Canadians rely on their pensions.
Honourable Member for Prince George, Peace River, Northern Rockies.
Mr. Speaker, thanks to just inflation, Northerners' paychecks are already running out before the end of the month.
That was a good... I'm sorry, I'm going to have to interrupt there. That's being dragged on a little too much, and it's doing indirectly... Whoa! It's doing indirectly what you can't do directly. So I just want to remind the honourable members to try to keep some decorum in the chamber and not mock each other. It's just not parliamentary. The honourable member, please continue.
Mr. Speaker, thanks to inflation, Northerners' paychecks are already running out before the end of the month. Food prices have increased. Gas prices are through the roof. Heating costs are skyrocketing. Housing projects have been cancelled due to massively increased construction costs. Now, instead of providing relief for Northerners, this Prime Minister is planning to increase the paycheck tax. Will the Prime Minister just answer my question? Will he cancel his planned paycheck tax increases, yes or no?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank my colleague for the question, because if there's one thing for certain that we have done is we have been there for people in Northern Canada. During COVID, when we knew there was a crisis around food security and heat security, one of the first things we did was step up to provide the extra resources they needed in each of their communities to get them through that process. We have been there for them through COVID, we've been there for them before that, and we will be there for them today and tomorrow.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Wetaskiwin.
Mr. Speaker, the Deputy Prime Minister answers every question with mock bewilderment that we dare question her record levels of spending and the increasing taxes to pay for it. She seems obsessed with Stephen Harper, whose record is clear. In 2015, just 7 years after a global economic meltdown, the Liberals inherited a balanced budget. Our Conservative government had lowered virtually every tax Canadians could pay, and Canada's middle class had become the richest in the world. Oh, how things have changed. Could the minister tell us, is Canada's growing affordability crisis due to just inflation, or is it just incompetence?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, Canadians know that Canada is pursuing a fiscally responsible policy. We have the lowest deficit in the G7, we have the lowest debt to GDP ratio, and our AAA credit rating was reaffirmed this year. Canadians also know we need to be compassionate and support our neighbours with affordability. And finally, Mr. Speaker, they know that now is not the time to eviscerate our pensions and eviscerate our EI.
The Honourable Member for Nunavut.
Indigenous communities deserve justice and a chance to heal from the legacy of residential schools. This government promised $200 million in funding for burial site searches, but has delivered less than half of that money. It is shameful that this government is denying Indigenous communities the funding needed to search for their lost children and for vital mental health supports. When will this government provide the funding Indigenous communities when they were promised to bring these children home.
The Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I mentioned 2 days ago, 91 projects are underway in communities to a total of about $100 million. The vast majority of people that have applied to our department have been funded for the first 2 years of their projects. We will be with them for the complete trajectory of where they will and need to be doing searches, which may be well over 5 to 10 years. It's something that we'll keep doing and keep investing on as communities approach us. There's much more work to do, indeed, Mr. Speaker, but clearly there is more money to come, and this is only a small snapshot of the investments, particularly in mental health, that have been done into communities. So only part of what my department does.
For Edmonton, Griesbach.
Indigenous people in my riding of Edmonton, Griesbach, and across Canada are overrepresented in the houseless population. The ones who do have housing, Mr. Speaker, live in overcrowded homes or homes in dire need of repair. Today, the Parliamentary Budget Office reported that homes are now 67% more expensive than what the average Canadian can afford. This government is failing to help Indigenous people who've been hit hard by the housing crisis. Before the next budget, will the Liberals fully fund the For Indigenous, By Indigenous housing initiative this government promised?
The Honourable Minister of Housing.
Mr. Speaker, I agree with the Honourable Member. We are committed to a For Indigenous, By Indigenous-led urban, rural and northern Indigenous housing strategy. That is why in Budget 2022 we've invested more than $4 billion to close the gap existing in Indigenous communities. This includes $300 million initial investment in an urban, rural and northern Indigenous housing strategy. And even in existing programs, you're seeing programs like the Rapid Housing Initiative, in which 41% of the housing is being led by Indigenous peoples and being delivered in Indigenous communities. I look forward to working with our partners to get this right, following a For Indigenous, By Indigenous principle.
For Cloverdale, Langley City.
Mr. Speaker, on September 23rd, the National Summit on Indigenous Mental Wellness, a first-of-its-kind event, brought together hundreds of participants to share best practices to support First Nations, Inuit, and Métis mental wellness. Could the Minister of Indigenous Services Canada update this House on the outcomes of this important summit?
The Honourable Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank the member of Cloverdale Langley for his question and his really hard work on reconciliation. Mr. Speaker, just last Friday, the Minister of Mental Health and Addictions and I hosted the first of its kind, a mental wellness summit, bringing together Indigenous leaders from across the country doing phenomenal work on mental wellness and substance use recovery. Mr. Speaker, we hope this is the first of its kind. It really was about Indigenous groups sharing best practices and learning from one another in a positive environment, and I'm so excited to share those great programs with the rest of the country.
The
Honourable Member for Bellechasse-les-Échevins-Lévis. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We, the Conservative members, tell people every day in this House what we're hearing in our ridings. We are hearing horror stories on the cost of living. There are more and more of our constituents who have to go to food banks. Mothers have to make painful choices. Young students have to sleep in homeless shelters. Winter is coming, and families will have a hard time heating their homes. Compassion, empathy, having a heart. That's what we're asking from the Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, can he give up his plan to increase taxes? The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, we understand the cost of living is rising for Canadian and Quebec families, and that is why we set up the Canadian benefit for families that will be that lifted 450,000 children out of poverty in this country. And if the Conservatives were really concerned by poverty and people who are suffering right now, well, it's simple. They will support our efforts to help the most vulnerable in this country. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Winston Churchill once said that trying to tax your nation into prosperity is like trying to stand in a bucket and pull yourself up by the handle. And if the Prime Minister is being honest, he'd admit that the carbon tax is just that. A tax that does nothing for the environment, but is designed to provide his government with buckets and buckets of cash from the wallets of Canadians. So will the Prime Minister cancel his plan to triple the tax on everyday essentials like gas, home heating, and groceries.
Hear, hear. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, and I think in difficult times we should all evoke the memory of Winston Churchill, who in difficult times said what was hard, told people straight what was difficult, and offered real solutions to those problems. We are in difficult times right now, Mr. Speaker, and what this country deserves is real solutions. What we're hearing throughout this question period and over the last 2 weeks is games, rhetorical rhetoric that frankly is not contributing to the solutions that we need to take. Our government is committed to helping those in need, and we certainly will continue in that direction.
Honourable member for Renfrew, Nipissing, Pembroke.
Mr. Speaker, this government loves taxes. Payroll taxes are going up, the carbon tax is tripling, and with 8% price hikes, and not just inflation, the cost of everything is going up. Will this government have mercy on Canadian families and axe the taxes?
The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
The issue of affordability for Canadians is one that concerns every member of this House. This government has acted to ensure that we are addressing that affordability issue. But I would say, with respect to the price on pollution, if you asked 100 economists, 99 will tell you it is the most efficient way to reduce emissions and incent innovation. It is a market-based approach. Market-based mechanisms are something the Conservative Party used to believe in, and certainly as recently as 10 months ago, every member on that side of the House campaigned on putting into place a price on pollution.
The Honourable Member for Regina Wascana.
Mr. Speaker, according to the Parliamentary Budget Officer, a majority of Canadians pay more in carbon taxes than they get back from this government. That means the rising cost of groceries, home heating, and filling the car up with gas will only get worse as this government proceeds to triple the carbon tax. Mr. Speaker, will the Liberal government back down from its harmful plan to triple the carbon tax?
The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think Canadians expect their leaders of all political stripes to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. We certainly have to address affordability pressures while we concurrently continue to address the existential threat that is climate change. We need to take into account the costs of inaction. A report released yesterday said that those costs of not acting will be up to $25 billion per year by 2025, $100 billion a year by 2050, 500,000 jobs lost. Mr. Speaker, taking action on climate change is about addressing affordability for Canadians and particularly for younger Canadians.
The Honourable Member for Thérèse de Blainville. Mr. Speaker, contrary to what the Conservatives are saying and what the Prime Minister used to say when he was in opposition, EI is not a tax on paychecks. But bad faith opposition members get to say that when there are people who pay into EI without being able to get payments. And bad faith oppositions can go ahead and say that because it has been 25 years since any government, Liberal or Conservative, has taken any kind of action. When will the minister finally reform the program so that it will stop abandoning 60% of those who lose their jobs? We want a date. Mr. Speaker, yes, we understand that EI payments must be fairer, more adapted to the needs of Canadian workers and the Canadian labour market, which is evolving constantly. And so we have committed to reforming the EI system in Canada, and we will announce our long-term plan to improve that EI system. The Honourable Member for Thérèse de Blainville. Mr. Speaker, when? It's irresponsible to keep postponing the reform that was promised 3 elections ago. But it's even more irresponsible to abandon the temporary measures, knowing that there is no reform in the books. The minister changed the rules for eligibility at the end of the seasonal cycle for industries. And so what happens to the workers who last Saturday were eligible at 420 hours and now have to have 700 hours to be eligible? Their industry is closing down for the winter, and what they're faced with is worse than a black hole. It's a void. What is the minister telling them to do? The Honourable Member. The Minister. So we know that the temporary measures that were established during the pandemic are coming to an end, but there will still be support provided to workers like before the pandemic. When it comes to the long-term plan, it will be presented before the end of the year, and we will be improving EIs very specifically.
It's the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, when we honor the children who suffered in residential schools and reflect upon those who never made it home. It is also a time to redouble our efforts to provide First Nations with a better future, clean water, an end to poverty, and the autonomy for those willing nations to control more of their money, their land, and their decision-making. Will the government discuss with the House how we can move forward together to achieve these goals?
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, and I'm so pleased to see the Leader of the Opposition's ambition in this space, because that's exactly what we've been showing, Mr. Speaker, since 2015, an ambition to move forward on reconciliation. And he hits all the high notes, Mr. Speaker. We're talking about things like truth and equity and self-determination, things that we know are going to ensure a brighter future for First Nations communities and individuals across this country. Mr. Speaker, we've done a lot. There's lots to say. I certainly can't cover it in 30 seconds, but I look forward to working with the party opposite to make sure we reach those goals together with Indigenous people.
The Honourable Member for Peace River Westlaw.
Mr. Speaker, the Liberal government and inflation are driving up the cost of living, especially for rural Canadians. Mike, a senior living in my riding, wrote to me on Monday saying that over the past year, his rent has increased by 50%, fuel costs are up by 40%, his medications up 22%, and his food costs are up by 12%. Like many Canadians, Mike is struggling under the burden of this government's tax on basic necessities and the idea of tripling the carbon tax. Will the Liberal government cancel their planned tax hikes on gas, groceries, and home heating today?
The Honourable Minister for Housing.
Mr. Speaker, we know that we need to be there for Canadians who are facing increased rent. That is why we introduced the Canada Housing Benefit, which is already providing an average of $2,500 to renters across the country who are struggling with the cost of rent. But we're not stopping there. We've introduced a one-time top-up to the Canada Housing Benefit of $500, which will go to help an additional 1.8 million Canadians. And what are the Conservatives doing? They're playing procedural games to delay that legislation that will enable Canadians to receive that help now. So what the honourable member can do is talk to his colleagues to make sure that we pass this important legislation to get rental help to Canadians today.
Honourable Member for Oshawa.
Mr. Speaker, Deb, a constituent, found out she was being evicted from her affordable apartment due to Liberal inflation. She worked her whole life as a nurse caring for others in need. Now, on a disability pension in her early 60s, she has no home security and a limited income that's being consistently eroded by new Liberal tax grabs. Will the Finance Minister give Deb hope and dignity for a future where she can afford a home, or will she condemn Deb to poverty in her senior years by tripling the tax on gas, heat, and groceries?
The Honourable Minister for Employment.
Speaker, I'll take this opportunity to remind everyone in this House that we have a historic moment ahead in front of us right now to come together and support the Canada Disability Benefit, to lift hundreds of thousands of Canadians out of poverty, make life affordable for them, give them the dignity that they deserve to live in. And I know we can do it together, because I know I've heard everyone in this House say they want to do it. So let's do it.
The Honourable Member for Châteauguay-L'École. Mr. Speaker, tomorrow we will be celebrating the second National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. It is an opportunity for Canadians to remember the historical relationship of Canada with Indigenous peoples and to think about the path of reconciliation that is before us. Can the Minister inform the House about the measures taken by this government to implement the calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, particularly the creation of a National Council for Reconciliation and a Commissioner for Indigenous Languages? And can you explain why, can the Minister explain why it's a crucial step? The Minister for Crown Indigenous Relations. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Reconciliation is not easy, it's not linear or free, but we will answer for the harms of the past and the consequences that are still being felt today by Indigenous peoples. And tomorrow we encourage all Canadians to think about the past and to show understanding for the future of Indigenous peoples. And we will also ask for Indigenous peoples to express themselves. And we know that Bill C-29 will answer the calls for actions 53 to 56 of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and will lead to the fulfillment of the 94 other calls to action.
Mr. Speaker, as of September 19th, Toronto police have recorded 31 homicides out of 302 shootings this year. Recent victims of gun violence include a Toronto police officer killed in a shooting rampage and a 17-year-old who was killed in broad daylight in Scarborough. The vast majority of these shootings are conducted by repeat offenders and drug traffickers with illegal guns. What is the Liberal solution? Remove Chrétien and Trudeau Sr. mandatory minimums and target law-abiding hunters and firearms owners. Considering these disturbing statistics, will the government remove their soft-on-crime Bill C-5?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, serious crimes in this country will always carry with them serious consequences. As indeed, the crimes that the honourable member is talking about do attract serious penalties, Mr. Speaker. What we're doing with C-5 is entirely the opposite. Failed Conservative policies on tough on crime, Mr. Speaker, with minimum mandatory penalties and no possibility of conditional sentence orders, have only clogged the justice system with less serious cases that have resulted in the over-incarceration of Indigenous and Black and racialized people in our system. Mr. Speaker, we're removing those to spend more time and more resources precisely on the offences that he's talking about.
The Honourable Member for Selkirk, Interlake, Eastman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Unfortunately, we know exactly how this Justice Minister thinks. Recently, he told the Senate that he empathized with dangerous drug dealers because they're only trying to put bread on the table. I'm not making this up. Violent crime is out of control, proving the Liberals' hug-a-thug policy doesn't work. While Canadian cities and communities are being terrorized by gangs and gun violence, this government refuses to hand out maximum penalties for these terrible crimes. When will this minister abandon his soft-on-crime policy and start locking up dangerous criminals?
The Honourable Minister.
Speaker, I'd invite the honourable member to actually look at the transcript of that Senate hearing. If he believes that an Indigenous woman with a problematic addiction who is trying to keep bread on the table for her 3 children, who sells some prescription drugs on the side, and then gets tackled with a minimum mandatory penalty, is the kind of serious offender that we need to lock up for that period of time, I would suggest that he's absolutely wrong. Mr. Speaker, what C-5 is allowing us to do is to allow people like that mother to get the help that they need, all the time spending more time and judicial resources, penal resources on the serious drug traffickers, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member, l'Honourable.
The Honourable Member for Chicoutimi-Le-Fjord. Mr. Speaker, the streets of Montreal are like a violent video game where the mission is to shoot pretty much anyone, anywhere. Last week, there was a mother and her spouse who were walking along the street in Longueuil, and a driver riddled them with bullets. And in response to that kind of violence, what has the Prime Minister done? He has presented a bill that gets rid of mandatory maximum penalties. And can he ask victims what they think about Bill C-5? Mr. Speaker, I am a Quebecer, I am a Montrealer, and I know what's happening in Montreal, in my riding and in other ridings in Montreal. But what we are doing with Bill C-5 is that we are channeling more resources to serious crimes, which will always have serious consequences. And with Bill C-5, we are increasing maximum penalties for offenses that are linked to gun violence. And Mr. Speaker, we are going in the right direction to be hard on violent crimes.
Centre.
Mr. Speaker, the Pan-Canadian Early Learning and Childcare System is up and running from coast to coast to coast with all provinces on side. In British Columbia, parents will be able to work, contribute to the economy, and make life more affordable for themselves, thanks to our federal government's investment in childcare. Can the Minister of Families, Children and Social Development update this House on the progress being made to date in my home province of BC?
Honourable Minister of Families.
Well, Mr. Speaker, it would be my pleasure to provide this House with that update. And first, I'd like to thank the honourable colleague for her tremendous years of advocacy on this issue. Mr. Speaker, I was in Vancouver and Burnaby actually last Friday with the provincial government to announce a doubling of $10 day spaces in British Columbia, as well as savings of up to 50% by this December for families in registered childcare. That's up to $6,600 a year for families in British Columbia. Mr. Speaker, that's making a real difference in their lives, and I'm excited about working with British Columbia and supporting families. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Winnipeg Centre.
Mr. Speaker, on International Safe Abortion Day, the Prime Minister said that he was committed to upholding, in quotes, a woman's fundamental right to choose. But here's the thing. The Liberals have yet to end charitable status for crisis pregnancy centres that help spread misinformation on abortion care. They promised to do it. It is in the Minister of Finance's mandate letter, but they still haven't done it. Instead of patting themselves on the back about how pro-choice they are, when will the Liberals act to remove charitable status from centres that mislead and shame women?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Our message is clear. The right to an abortion and access to abortion go hand in hand. Every person in our country should have the access to safe, equitable and consistent healthcare services. Here in Canada, universal access to abortion is guaranteed under the Canada Health Act. We will continue to advocate for a women's right to choose. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Kitchener Centre.
Mr. Speaker, in my community and across the country, we are in a housing crisis. Yet our housing market encourages corporate investors to treat homes like stocks, making huge profits on the backs of regular people. The federal government could remove tax exemptions for corporate investors tomorrow, instead of bragging about studying the issue. When will the Minister of Housing ensure homes are for people, not commodities for investors to trade?
The Honourable Minister for Housing.
Speaker, we understand the issue. That is why we've already implemented a 1% annual tax on the value of non-resident, non-Canadian owned residential real estate. We are introducing a 2-year ban on foreign investment in Canadian residential real estate. We've committed to reviewing the tax treatment of real estate investment trusts, and we are launching a federal review of housing as an asset class. On this side of the House, Mr. Speaker, we're committed to making housing more affordable by doing our part to tackle the financialization of housing.
I'm afraid that's all the time we have for today. C'est tout le temps que nous avons. The honourable member for Winnipeg Centre is rising on a point of order.
Mr. Speaker, I was trying to ask a question, and the member from Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan, started heckling me. And I know it's difficult for him to control his toxic masculinity, but I think people across Canada expect a lot better. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I'm going to take a deep breath and remind all the members, please, when they're addressing each other, to address each other with respect, regardless of what is done to them or what is said. We want to keep as much decorum and respect in the chamber. And I also want to remind the honourable members, when somebody is asking a question or answering, please do not shout them down. That is not a polite way of acting. Very good. There's 2 apologies that should come out of that, but I'm not going to touch either one of them. We'll continue. Another point of order, the honourable member for Opposition House Leader.
point of order.
Oh, sorry. The question.
I have a very important question, Mr. Speaker. Can the Honourable Government House Leader update the House as to the business of the House for the rest of this, well, I guess, for next week? And I would point out that when the House Leaders were given the calendar for next week, there are a couple of open days, and I would make the suggestion as he prepares his response to this question that either one of those empty days would be perfect opportunity for a piece of legislation to cancel the tripling of the Liberal carbon tax.
The Honourable Government House Leader is answer to the Thursday question.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And before I begin, let me say a thank you to the member opposite and to all Conservative members for their support to continue and advance C-30, which is critical support at this time on the issue of affordability. I want to thank them for helping to move it to committee and for their work to move it through committee. And Mr. Speaker, that will be our priority next week to ensure